Thank you for coming to the session on governance and the wealth and inequality of nations. In this session, the objective is to broaden the discussion about business and management research as it relates to the role of business in society. And Christine, Beckman, and I are the co-coordinators, and we'll be acting as moderators of this session. Christine is the director of the Center for Social Value Creation at the University of Maryland, and I am the director of the Snider Center for Enterprise and Markets. And as you can tell, there might be differences in the underlying assumptions and philosophical premises that might guide each of these centers as well. So when Christine and I, who are great friends and we enjoy talking to each other quite a bit, one of the things that we cooked up together is, wouldn't it be nice if we can create a session at the Academy where we would still have an open, reasoned and respectful discourse on these issues that are so much at the forefront of news these days. So Christine and I thought about getting our minds together in addition to people that we would like to hear speak on both sides of the issue. So this session is intended as a debate, and you've got distinct sides. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the side that's going to be representing the Snider Center, Enterprise and Market Thought, and that would be Yaron Brook, who is the executive director of the Ayn Rand Institute. Yaron has a PhD in finance and is a very articulate proponent of free markets and its role in inequality and wealth of nations, or trade-offs or not thereof. He is a very frequent contributor across many, many TV stations and radio stations. He actually has a radio station that comes out of Chicago, right, that talks about these issues. John Allison is the past president of BB&T, the 12th largest bank in the country, and more recently, the president of Cato Institute, again, a think tank that thinks a lot about policy issues as it relates to the role of markets and government and society. At this point, then, I'm going to cede to Christine, who's going to introduce the Center of Social Value Creation talks, as well as lay out the first of the two questions that they're going to debate on. So thank you and welcome.
Terrific. So I'm going to introduce the two speakers here. We have Jerry Davis, professor at the University of Michigan, has a PhD from Stanford. For these purposes, it's notable that he has worked a lot on the effects of finance on society, interested in income equality in the economy, as well as the viability of shareholder capitalism as a model. He's written books, several books for our purposes, again, a book called Managed by the Market, about the influence of finance on markets, which won the 2010 Terry Book Award at the Academy of Management. And then Roger Martin, who currently is the director of the Martin Prosperity Institute at Rotman. Before that was the dean at the Rotman School for 15 years, is on the Thinker 50 list of influential global business thinkers, also the author of several books on integrative thinking and design thinking. And he started his career at Monitor, a global consulting firm, where he was there for many years and actually founding the Canadian office and serving as co-head at the firm. So delighted to have everyone here. And as Rajshree said, we're going to do a debate format, so it's going to be quick and back and forth to keep it interesting. I'm going to have my timer that's going to go off to let everyone know that their time is up. So the first, there's two questions that we're going to be addressing. The first is there a trade-off between inequality and the wealth and growth of nations? Yaron's going to start with 5 minutes. We're going to go 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5, and then there's going to be a rebuttal period of 3 minutes and 3 minutes. So that's going to be the format that we're going to use, and then we'll go on to the second question, which I'll tell you about after. So why don't we hand it over? Yaron, you're up first.
Setting up my timer.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, terrific.
So first, I feel the burden of responsibility. I didn't know I was representing the Snider Center, so you'll have to tell Ed that I did, hopefully did him well. Thank you all for being here. Thank you guys for organizing this panel. This is a fascinating issue. I will mention, because Rajshree didn't, that I do have a book coming out, forthcoming book, and I think the title of it will tell you much about what I think about this issue. The title of the book is Equal is Unfair. And it'll be, it's on Amazon, you can pre-order it. It'll be out in April of next year. I find this whole question of inequality and growth as being irrelevant. There is no relationship between inequality of growth unless, that is not the issue. The issue at the end of the day, in my view, is the issue of freedom, of individual personal freedom, of economic freedom, and the relation between freedom and economic prosperity and human flourishing and individual success. Inequality is relevant. I have no idea if in a free market than we have today, inequality would increase or decrease, and I don't care. And I don't think anybody should care. I think there's an interesting question about the fate of the poor under different types of economic systems and whether they prosper or don't prosper. I think the evidence is quite clear about that as well. But the differences, the relative differences between people strikes me as unimportant, morally unimportant, and economically unimportant. Now, what's important is the ability of people to have opportunities to succeed in life, to prosper in life, to flourish in life. And I don't know of any system that maximizes those opportunities more than a free system. A system that allows people to choose the values they want to live by and pursue the values that they believe will enhance their own personal lives. And again, relative wealth, relative income, relative ability in basketball is only relevant in a zero-sum world, but we don't live in a zero-sum world. So who cares? However, the other side is going to present a lot of data. And let me just say, I haven't seen the data yet, but I've done enough of these debates to know the data will be presented. And indeed, there's a number of studies, including an OECD study that came out a few months ago, that shows that countries with high inequality have low growth. I warn you, and I encourage you to dig deep into the data. What is being controlled for? What are the actual variables that are being looked at? What do they actually mean by inequality? There's enough skepticism, enough doubt already being placed on the very, very detailed, intense work that Piketty put together for his book. And he's had to withdraw a number of his assertions based on critiques of that data. Data, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, data's tricky. You have to know exactly what you're measuring and exactly what you're regressing against what and how you're doing it. So I'm skeptical. I'm eager to see the data and see what's going to be presented. But one of the things that the OECD and a number of the other studies that I've seen don't do is they don't control for other factors. So yes, inequality in Zimbabwe is very high and economic growth is negative. But there's no causal relationship there. Causality is not the same as correlation. So I would just give these two anecdotes. China has experienced some of the most rapid economic growth in human history over the last 30 years. Inequality has exploded. The United States experienced the highest economic growth in human history during the 19th century. Economic growth exploded. Sweden, during its capitalist days, experienced some of their largest economic growth ever. Inequality exploded. It's only shrunk recently, and indeed economic growth shrunk with it. The inequality shrunk in economic growth. So if anything, the world seems to suggest that economic growth goes hand in hand with rising inequality. And that's a good thing, because rising inequality in those cases, when the economy is actually growing, increases the well-being of pretty much everybody in society, but unequally. That is, some rise very fast and some rise slowly. Thank you. I think that's my 5 minutes.
I feel I've been well anticipated, thank you. I am going to talk about data. This is actually an empirical question that can be answered, at least in principle, using data. So what's the unit of analysis? As a researcher, as an editor, I think about data, running fancy regressions, and can you measure this stuff and define it in a clear way? So I want to be able to answer this by telling you there actually are data that you could dig into for this. Unit of analysis, the nation state, what's the distribution? What's the dependent variable? We're broadly saying economic vibrancy. I'll get into more detail in a second. What's the independent variable here? So as a researcher, I love measurable independent variables like wealth or income inequality. You can actually measure those things. I don't care for unmeasurable conceptual variables like equality of opportunity. That's a useless variable. You can't answer any question with something that is clearly just conceptual. If you're interested, go to this website, worldinequality.org, and you can download all the data that I'm about to talk about. So here are links for all of the data, national level, every variable you can think of. You can rerun any of the regressions, and you can figure out that I control for the right things. Yaron, you can do this on your phone right now with these variables. What do we mean by inequality? We could talk about wealth. If you're snarky, you'd say 6 heirs of the Walmart fortune have a net worth equal to that of the bottom 41% of the US population. That is freedom, because obviously they merited that wealth by being born into the right family. You could look at income inequality. A recently bandied about figure that the 25 best paid hedge fund managers earn more than the US kindergarten teachers all as a group. But the average hedge fund manager maybe not as much. I'm going to focus on national level income inequality. It's well defined. This is what PKT talks about, and you can find data on this rampantly and run the regressions you like and control for whatever you like. So Gini coefficient runs from 0, perfect equality, to 1. Bill Gates has all of the income each year. And it's really clear from various studies that income inequality correlates strongly with many, many bad things, like infant mortality rates, homicide rates, rates of imprisonment, rates of mental illness. Correlation doesn't equal causation. We're not saying mental illness. Who knows? There's many third factors, but it's clear that the correlates are really bad. And in every study of the OECD, the US is this bizarre outlier, and Canada actually seems kind of normal. Is inequality just the price we pay? Respect. Booyah, as the deans like to say. Is inequality just the price we pay for prosperity? So this is a Gini coefficient on the left, GDP per capita on the right. The answer is opposite. The richer countries get, the lower their inequality, unless you're a Chinese city-state like Singapore, Hong Kong, or the United States. Now there is an off-diagonal. Former communist countries still have smaller economies, relatively speaking, and lower inequality as a vestige of the past. But for all non-communist countries, there's a very strong correlation. The richer you get, the lower your level of inequality. China's an interesting case. They've gotten a lot richer and much, much more unequal, exactly as Yaron says. I would ask you to contemplate whether a communist dictatorship is a really good exemplar of how freedom leads to economic growth. That one for me doesn't parse, but that's just me. You could also ask, hasn't inequality increased all around the world because of the internet or something like that? The answer is no. Actually, there is no general trend towards greater inequality at the national level, within national economies, which is a relevant way to define the outcome. So got the US up top, and things have gone up and down over time. What causes inequality? Is it that the internet led to skill-biased economic growth and certain people know Python coding and others don't, and that's why they make more money? Well, look at the UK. When did inequality start, and when did the World Wide Web appear? There's only one variable, but I'd have to say there's a pretty strong cause for the change in inequality, and it's not economic growth. Canada is the mystery to me because it's so much like the US, but so much more equal, much greater equality. It's bumped along normally for the entire time, except for 1 year, 1975. And the only explanation I have is that the Rolling Stones came to Toronto to record Some Girls, and they single-handedly raised the inequality in Canada, impregnated Margaret Trudeau with Justin. Oh, don't film that, sorry. And then moved back to the United Kingdom and took their inequality with them. So that's my 5 minutes.
All right. I'm not an academic, so I don't have a slide presentation. I do have a lot of research, however, from the Cato Institute in the back of my head. I would refer you to Cato has a website called humanprogress.org. And here's what's very interesting. Inequality on the planet without these arbitrary national boundaries has been in a free fall. Billions of people have been brought out of poverty in the last 20 years. I mean, the statistics are amazing. And going from $100 a year to $300 a year in Bangladesh is a big deal versus having slower economic growth in the UK. The quality of life changes are stunning. The single biggest factor correlated, and this is, go to humanprogress.org to Cato, and you can see this over and over again, is economic freedom. When people increase economic freedom, i.e. when China lets go of communism, when India lets go of many of the socialist constraints, the quality of life improves for everybody. Now, some people are more beneficiaries when that happens, but everybody is better off. So what we know with certainty is that freedom, it's not surprising, economic freedom leads to higher life, quality of life for everybody, and inequality has been on a free fall on the planet in recent years, and it's pretty dramatic, because we're talking, we had these riots in Baltimore, and my reaction is there aren't any poor people in Baltimore. Poor people live in Bangladesh. That's where poor people live. People in Baltimore have cell phones, and they have indoor plumbing, which my parents didn't have. So it's a lot of, it's a very interesting how you want to look at the poverty question. The other point I would make is that, we talk about in the United States, all people are created equal. The concept was equality for the law. Here's the fact. People are not equal. We're all different. We all have different strengths, different abilities, different aptitudes, different ambitions, and that's good. We're all unique, special individuals, and that's the good news. That's what makes us human. But we're not equal. The only way to get equal outcomes from unequal people is to use force to take what someone else has produced and give it to someone else who has not produced it. And the use of force consistently reduces productivity, reduces freedom, it reduces well-being in a deeper sense. I don't buy I think there is economic inequality matters, but the real test is happiness, isn't it? And that's a little more subtle kind of criteria. In addition, and this will tell you a little bit about my own life experiences where I came from, I want to concretize what we're really talking about. One of my heroes is Michael Jordan. I'm not as good a basketball player as Michael Jordan, which may surprise many of you. What's interesting is I can't get to be as good a basketball player as Michael Jordan. I don't care how hard I tried, tried to help me. I cannot be as good a basketball player as Michael Jordan. You cannot make the average great. You can make the average better. That may be a very productive, very good thing to do. But you can't make the average great. However, you can make the great average. By definitions, egalitarians are in the business of making the great average. And they're doing it by the use of force, and that has long-term economic consequences and long-term consequences in terms of human well-being and happiness. And it's worse than just average. I grew up in the Baptist church, and in the Baptist church they want everybody to sing, except me, because I am a horrible singer. And the only way to make people as good a singer to me would be to reduce the quality of singing on the whole planet, to make everybody equal singers. What do we mean by equal? Equal amount of money, equal amount of talent, equal amount of happiness. You see children born in the same family, same parents, same everything, and they end up with radically different outcomes in terms of economic success, happiness, their abilities to do art, different things. What do we mean by this whole concept? I think human flourishing is about the right of each of us to live our lives on our own terms. And when you start taking guns and making people do things they don't want to do and taking what people have produced, keeping Michael Jordan from being a great basketball player or somebody from being a great singer, when you reduce the great people, you reduce the quality of life for all of us. And that's really what this debate is about. Now, to the degree that inequality is created by government force, by cronyism, that certainly should be eliminated. But us advocates of free markets think the government shouldn't be subsidizing General Motors and it shouldn't be subsidizing General Electric. We ought to live in a free society. But as long as the outcomes are just, as long as people have earned whatever it is, whether it be talent or whether it be money, based on free trade with other people, that is the optimal outcome by definition. And history shows that that's what produces the highest standard of living, the best growth rates for all of us. And it's overwhelmingly true. And it would be a shame with all this revolution happening in the rest of the world that's driving radical improvements in the quality of life throughout the planet that we would choose to go in the wrong direction and put government constraints on entrepreneurs, innovators, take away the capital that's needed for growth, and reduce our ability to continue to grow our economy. And by the way, I think some of that's already happening in terms of regulations and other things that don't necessarily distribute money, but they redistribute freedom.
Okay. So I'm a huge fan of democratic capitalism, a combination of democracy and capitalism, where 51% or more of people decide who runs the country, and it's a capitalist system. I'm a huge fan of the United States, my adoptive country, and for 213 years that mainly worked one way, from 1776 to 1989, which is in that period the median household in terms of income had a good chance of next year being more economically ahead than the year before. There were two periods, extended periods, where that wasn't the case: the Long Depression in the late 1800s and the Great Depression in the 1930s. In both of those periods, from the prior peak to when they got an income higher than before, the median income was between 12 and 16 years, depending exactly on how you measured it. Between 1989 and 2014, the median income hasn't increased. So something happened to the U.S. Economy to have the longest period in history of the median income person not moving ahead. The challenge for that, I think, is that if we want democracy and capitalism, that median income family is metaphorically the swing voter. And if they don't feel like they're moving ahead, we have a challenge. And we have a challenge, I think, in America of that change in the economy. And I'm just going to skip ahead here. If you look at all the jobs in America and break them down on two categories, one category that Michael Porter created, another that Richard Florida created, to say whether the person has a job that's creativity intensive, that requires independent judgment and decision making, or not. So everybody here has one that's in the creativity intensive business or occupation. Accounts payable clerks or assembly line workers are in the routine oriented. Mike Porter said you can either have a job in a traded cluster, an industry that's not distributed randomly across the economy, that trades outside its area, versus local, that serves local. So a landscaping shop, a beauty salon is local, a pharmaceutical company is traded. What's happened is, and then if you look at what that means economically, is the following. So the widths of the bars are the size of those occupations. So 13.9% of people are in the traded creative, 44.8% are in routine local, and the height of the bar is the deviation from the weighted average wage, not the median wage, because it's harder to do against the median. So the weighted average wage. And the challenge, as I see it, is we now have 44.8% of workers in local jobs and routine industries that are making dramatically less than the national average. And the bigger problem is that is the fastest growing segment of the economy. This is just 2000 versus 2013. And for me, the challenge for democratic capitalism in America, it's not how much government intervention there is. This is only barely relevant. The question is, can we make the prospects of the 44.8% of American workers better than these prospects, i.e., the discount against the median, the average income is increasing dramatically, the size is increasing dramatically. Those people are being left out of the economic progress equation, and they're soon going to be the electorate. When that crosses 50%, they're the electorate, and capitalism, democratic capitalism, is not working for them. And unlike in the Great Depression, where actually the top 1% and the top 10% took a harder hit than the median family, in this period, the top 1% and the top 10% are doing better than they've ever done in the history of America. And now this huge block are in jobs that are not going to do anything for them unless something about that changes. So for me, the question is, how can we make sure democratic capitalism survives and prospers? And it's going to have an answer for that before they get past 51%. Thank you.
Set up my clock, okay. So I guess I still don't see what the issue is with inequality. There is a problem in America today. That I agree completely. There are lots of problems. I don't see any of them being problems of inequality. You know, who knows, there is this block of 44% of people that are being held behind in the United States, and that is troubling. It could be the fact that we've added 1 billion or 2 workers to the global workplace that has, in a globalized economy, had put pressure on wages, downward pressure on wages. It could be, this would be a shock, that our educational system is really bad, and we need to do something dramatic about our educational system to allow people with maybe limited skills to be able to make higher wages and be more productive. I think that's a big part of it, and it's no surprise to me that that is a sector that is all government, or almost all government, a government monopoly basically. It could be that there are other restraints on the ability of people to experience a robust opportunity set in order to rise up from whatever condition they have in the world today and improve it. Those are all interesting questions. Inequality is uninteresting. The relative position they have relative to other people, the fact that Steve Jobs and Bill Gates made a fortune during this period is now relevant to the fact that some people did not. Indeed, I'd say the opposite. If Steve Jobs and Bill Gates had not made a fortune during that period, then those 44% probably would be in worse shape than they are today, because many, many jobs would have disappeared and much economic progress would not have been achieved. And I just have to say something about the Walton family. It is true that the heirs of Walton mostly have not done anything to so-called deserve this wealth, but their dad did. Their dad created that wealth. That wealth did not exist before their dad built one of the greatest corporations in human history that has benefited more people than probably any other corporation in human history, called Walmart. And he created that wealth, and you know what? He gets to decide how to use it. In this case, he left it to his kids. It's still theirs because their father created it and built it. And the fact that they have more wealth than X number of people is not important. It's not relevant to anything. It doesn't slow economic growth. I'll just end with this. I don't know if I've got 20 seconds. I'm curious what economic theory, and I don't know if there are any economists here, what economic theory would explain the relationship between inequality and economic growth? I have never heard of one. I have never heard of one. Keynesianism doesn't do it. Certainly, there's no economic theory that actually explains that relationship. So, yes, you can find correlations, but where's the causality? What's the relationship? Why is this happening? Economists can't explain this because there is no theory to explain it, because it's not true.
So I love that John wanted to redefine the unit of analysis and say if you just ignore national boundaries, then the problem goes away. I love that because it makes the research impossible and we end up with an N of 1. So if you eliminate national boundaries and they're irrelevant to human well-being, that makes the problem much easier. But if you do that, you learn that all of the action is in China, that all of the action in reducing inequality is China becoming rich. And John also mentioned that when China abandoned communism, then things really took off. I've been to China. It is a communist dictatorship. I don't mean this in a bad or negative or evaluative way. I'm just saying there are no elections. It's run by the Communist Party. It is not a free society. Try using Google in China. Freedom did not create that, at least not the normal kind of democratic freedom, maybe some weird level of freedom. John mentioned that equality in the Constitution means equality before the law and not equal outcomes, and that is definitely true. I would ask you to reflect on the last year in the United States and ask yourself about equality before the law. And how much is equality before the law true? Do Waltons get pulled over, tasered, stuck in prison, or killed by police when they're unarmed? Maybe, maybe not. But to me, it doesn't feel like we've achieved that kind of sort of particular equality. On the Waltons, clearly they are like welfare cheats. Basically, they're being given money that makes them dependent on other people. They didn't earn that money. It doesn't come from their, John referred to justly earned outcomes based on free trade. They didn't do that. So I think that the presumable outcome is we need to have a confiscatory inheritance tax to take all wealth from extremely wealthy people so that they will have to get a job, learn their talents, and compete freely with everyone else. What economic theory explains inequality? The problem with inherited wealth is that heirs of wealth, in fact, there is research by Rajshree and Luigi Zingales that what they call the Canada curse, that inherited wealth, sorry. It is that the heirs, that entrepreneurs who make money are great for economic growth. Their children, and especially their grandchildren, are poisoned because they have every reason to use their wealth to distort the political process to hang on to what they've got and prevent people from challenging the incumbents. I consider that an economic theory because they're Chicago economists, so that would count for me.
And it is true in Canada.
Yeah, and the jobs generated by Apple, there are no jobs generated in the United States by the Apple Corporation. Read my papers, probably out of my 3 minutes. So.
Promised you it would be controversial. So several of the comments are actually going and feeding very well into our second question, which is what are the institutional and organizational factors that underlie any potential trade-offs and solutions? And we're going to start with Roger, and then we're going to give the mic to John, and then Jerry will get 5 minutes, and Yaron will end up, and then rebuttal time will be Roger for 3 minutes, and then John for 3 minutes. Oh, yes, and Jerry, yes? Yeah, so Jerry does have to leave at 2, but we'll still have plenty of time to do that. And then, of course, we expect to have a very nice Q&A discussion as well.
So I would say, and continuing a little on the last, for my perspective, the challenge is a democratic capitalist challenge, not a capitalist challenge. So the challenge is if you want the two of those things, then inequality is a challenge if the 51% of the country sees no prospect for moving ahead or little prospect for moving ahead. So the question, for the fundamental economic question for me for democratic capitalism is how can we make sure that we have an economy in which the result is that 51% at the 51st percentile voter and economic actor does consistently move forward. That is what made America great, right? America is a great country because it managed for 213 years to make that happen better than anybody else. What are the boundaries to that happening? I think actually the boundaries are managerial theory more than anything else. Right? So I think the 44.8% are stuck in that world because talent has become the key asset in the modern economy. The returns to talent are lengthening, and if your talent isn't being used, there is no room for you in the economic equation. Talent, high-end talent, is now taking up more and more of the economic growth. That's why the top 1% is getting between 60 and 80% of the economic growth. It's not a bad thing in and of itself. It's just leaving little room left in the economic equation. So if you grow the economy and talent takes a big piece of it, the folks who are put in the box of having a routine job where they're not asked to do any independent judgment and decision making are going to be hurt. They're going to fall backwards, and there's going to be less left for them in the equation. It doesn't have to be that way. It's only that way because companies take the decision to say, that's what I want. And I think this is the last vestiges of a modernist kind of economic system which focused on standardization and scale. Companies that say, no, we're actually going to take people who would be normally in that 44.8% box and treat them differently, make them more productive by using the most important muscle in their body, which is the one between their ears, have done brilliantly doing it. So Quick Trip is a perfect example, and this is the work of a wonderful woman at MIT, Zeynep Ton, who shows they have a strategy that says those people we need to get to think. It's a $11.5 billion C-store chain in the Midwest, the most profitable C-store chain in America, actually run by a staunch Republican. So this is not a sort of I'm going to be nice to the employees because I'm kind of left wing or wet. It's the way to have this convenience store chain do great is to have my people in the stores have greater ability to exercise independent judgment and decision-making. In fact, that is the expectation. They will be trained in that fashion. So their turnover is a fraction of the turnover in the industry. The sales per square foot is extraordinary and off the charts, and there are numerous other examples of that. It is, though, still the minority view of business. The majority view of business is you try and standardize those routine workers, pay them as little as possible, accept the turnover that you accept, and until we change that managerial philosophy, I think, we are going to have this continued problem, and the 44.8 will go to 51%, and they will say the top 1% are getting everything, we're getting nothing, and there will be a democratic backlash against the capitalism we have. I don't believe this is fundamentally a government problem. I actually believe it's fundamentally a business management problem. Thank you.
I'll start by responding to a couple questions that were said before. It's not factually correct that the only improvement in the standard of living in the world is in China. That's not even close to the truth. That's so far from the truth, it's discouraging. There's a huge improvement in India. There's a huge improvement in most of Africa. There's a huge improvement in parts of South America. So there's a rising standard of living and less inequality in most of the rest of the world. It's not just China. Second, while China is technically a communist dictatorship, anybody that does business in China knows that economic freedom has increased radically in China in recent years, and they would say that's why they're having an improvement in their standard of living, because they have a greater economic freedom, more entrepreneurship, et cetera. Secondly, again, going back to facts, and you can go to the Cato website, this issue of the increase in inequality since 1989, which people like to somehow associate with Thatcher and Reagan, is very unclear. If you go back and adjust for changes in tax laws, and particularly if you adjust for transfer payments, what you find is there's not been that radical change in inequality in the United States, and it's particularly, you probably have had an improvement if you take out about 1% of the population. There's less inequality than 99% than there was before. We've had a few outliers, the Waltons, et cetera, et cetera. So the statistics on the increase in inequality are pretty big. To the degree that there has been an issue with our relative improvement in the standard of living. Oh, just one more point. Anybody that's alive today probably knows that the standard of living is better today than it was in 1989, or certainly in 1950. When I grew up, people have better lives. They have a lot better things. And life expectancy shows that. I mean, we had a radical, what's the single biggest measure? Life expectancy. Life expectancy has improved radically. So we know we're better off than we were in 1989, whether we're more or less equal or not. But if you want to say what I think is driving the inequality problem, I think one is not much we can do about. I think our lower skilled workforce is competing with people on the rest of the planet that are willing to work harder for less. And they're raising their standard of living, and that's a competitive environment, and that's a challenge. But I think the bigger problem by far is a failed educational system. It's a failed educational system that statistics prove this are not teaching students how to think critically. And what is the skill set that you have to have in the kind of world we have today? You got to be a critical thinker. And we're finding a lot of people that could go into an old textile mill. It's not that they have to be tech people, they just don't have the capacity to think critically, to innovate in their own lives. So if you want to fix the inequality issue to the degree that there is an issue, then what you've got to do is fix the educational system. And I think that's radical reform. I think you've got to create competition in education. We know competition spurs innovation, spurs creativity, spurs better outcomes. And if you don't do that, then we're going to continue to have an education system that doesn't teach people to be critical thinkers, and therefore we're going to have a real struggle with the standard of living relative to what is possible in particular versus the inequality issue. So I think the issue is mostly about education and skills to compete in the global economy. And by the way, the other people are raising and improving their standards of education in many, many cases.
So mad props again to Canada for your extremely awesome education system, because Canada has so much lower inequality than the US. State-funded education. The cab driver's kid who's smart can get a college education at Canada and become a college professor or doctor. So again, mad props to Canada. It's America's conjoined twin, except no gun violence, low inequality, high mobility, and a higher standard of living. So if that's the thing we're going for, go Canada. So John is totally right that the question about how to solve inequality is really, really hard. And I've spent way more of my life studying this than I should have. So inequality is kind of like triglycerides in the blood. It is not the key most important thing. It's an indicator of other problems with the organization or issues with the organization of the economy. It's not inevitable. You can have low inequality and a great standard of living and high levels of mobility. Denmark seems fine. Canada seems great. It's not inevitable that you use tech, and they're very entrepreneurial cultures in their own way. One of the biggest factors behind this turns out to be the social organization of the economy and how you organize the corporate sector. It's a bizarre statistical fact. The link between the concentration of employment, the proportion of the population working in large corporations, and inequality, 1950 to 2010, is negative 0.9, which for nerds means that's a really big number. Remarkably correlated. It really isn't just unionization or simple thing. It is the social organization of the economy and the corporate sector. This turns out to be true around the world. The way you organize corporations turns out to be highly related to economic vibrancy and inequality. This is what the rest of the world looks like. If you take out the commie corner down there, they're the outliers that ruin all my regressions. But Nordic countries, old Europe, as Cheney used to call it, much lower inequality, vibrant, technically literate, a high quality of living, activist government. If you want high inequality, go for Colombia, Brazil, Chile. They're incapable of growing large organizations. So if you want to get the firms that generate greater equality, you need to have an institutional surround that makes this possible. I wish I could say it's the death of unions, the end, but it really isn't. It's a complex set of factors that generates equalities. I agree entirely with John. It's not a simple problem, and there is not a simple fix to go along with it. It's about the whole social organization and institutional infrastructure. So confiscatory wealth tax, great idea, but it will not on its own eliminate inequality.
Since we're making statements, confiscatory wealth tax, awful idea, and we'll make the world a worse place for those who can least afford the worst place. I'll just a few comments, kind of wrapping up bits and pieces that were mentioned. Since we've mentioned Chicago economists, I would strongly recommend with regard to China that you read How China Became Capitalist by Ronald Coase. It shows how China became capitalist. So how China, first of all, China is not a communist country. If you ever been to a communist country when communism was around, and you go to Shanghai today, Shanghai is as capitalist in just the way people behave and the expression. It's not democratic capitalism, but there is more economic freedom in parts of China than there is in Canada and the United States. And certainly the billboards are bigger. Communism didn't have Coca-Cola billboards. So China has economic freedom. Does it have as much economic freedom as I would like? No. Does it have as much freedom as I would like? Certainly not. But to think of China in terms of capitalism as central planning is a dreadful mistake. And if you read Ronald Coase, he explains how China's growth, how China's progress all happened at the margins, at the forgotten places where central planners weren't paying attention. And everything that was central planned failed. And the genius of Deng Xiaoping and the rest of the Chinese was to encourage the experiments at the margin, at the non-central plan experiments. And then when they succeeded, to let them flourish and not to oppress them. Just a side on China. My friends who make apps for the Apple and Corning Glass would be surprised that Apple creates no jobs. And I would encourage everybody to read the latest statement from the Danish king. I didn't know they had a king, but they have a king, who just declared the end of the Danish welfare state because they're on the verge of bankruptcy, and they're going to have to reform the Danish welfare state dramatically. Just last week, the king makes a statement in the name of the prime minister. It's not his opinions; he has to make it in the name of the prime minister. But literally announced the end of the Danish welfare state, which was kind of amusing because all they're talking about is a tiny little reduction in the size of the welfare state, and they're already talking about it's going away. So no, what we have is really, at the end of the day, is a question of freedom. And I'm not so much concerned about democratic capitalism. I'm concerned about capitalism. I'm concerned about freedom and less about democracy. And I would argue that most of the challenges, I agree, by the way, about the issue of talent in the modern world and specialization and the rewards to talent. There's some great papers by Stephen Kaplan on this, on the rewards to ability because of a globalized economy and because of technology. But I'd also say that what's really holding people back, in addition to the issue of education, is all the government controls and government regulations that we have imposed on our economy over the last 70 years. Even the Obama administration has recently come out with a paper saying that licensing laws in the United States are nuts, are crazy, and need to be rolled back because they're hurting the ability of poor people to be entrepreneurial, poor people to find jobs, because if you need a license to shampoo hair, you're not going to get a job. 30% of professions in the United States today are licensed, which is insane. Braiding, hair braiding, and lots of others. So licensing laws. I'd love to have a debate on minimum wage, which I have a feeling we could have here. Minimum wages keep people down. They don't raise people up. They keep people down. They prevent young inner city youth from finding that first job that makes it possible for them to learn the skills that will then make it possible for them to rise. And many of the regulations on business that have come to be over the last 20 years, in spite of the mythology of George Bush being a deregulator, he's one of the worst regulators in American history, that have constrained the growth of business and constrained the growth of productive jobs in the U.S. economy and constrained the amount of opportunities that people have faced, that people face in the U.S. economy. The issue is opportunity. What we need is to maximize opportunity. The issue is not, again, inequality. And to maximize opportunity, you need to maximize freedom. You need to maximize entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship is far more vibrant when it is left alone. It's one of the reasons the technology sector is where you do see job creation. The technology sector is where you do see entrepreneurship, because it's the one sector that, relatively speaking, has been left unregulated, has been left alone. Now Washington's trying to change that. They're being quite rigorous about trying to change that. But for the last 30 years, with some antitrust exceptions, they've kept their hands off of Silicon Valley, and what we've seen is incredible innovation, growth, and success in that sector. And if we want that to continue, and we want that expanded, we need government hands off of business.
So, I have to say, this is one of the you could knock me over with a feather moments. I mean, I was like, I'm stunned. I'm stunned. I'm concerned about freedom, not about democracy. And this wet kiss for China on economic freedom. I'm just like blown away. Blown away. I care deeply about democracy. I care that in China they can bulldoze your house. I mean, the notion the notion that that's all that matters. I mean, is stunning to me. On the better off than 1989, yeah, John, you are. I am. We're both card-carrying members of the top 1%, and we are so much better off. But you have, I think, literally no idea what the median income person feels like now versus 1989, and so it's easy to say that. I mean, I think, and where the Danish welfare state comes into this debate is beyond my comprehension. I guess in the end it's a big system, and as I say, I'm just stunned and amazed. I care so deeply about the notion that 51% of people vote for a government that represents them. That's the system that I care about maintaining, and actually, it doesn't matter a huge amount to me if I have more economic freedom and I can be thrown in jail without a trial, picked up off the street, my stuff confiscated, and that's basically what. You're basically saying you don't care about democracy. Well, you're talking about economic freedom, and you both did, and I can imagine you're now going to want to retract those things, but count me as not finding your line of thinking useful to my life at all.
Well, good, because I don't care about your life. We are obviously arguing for freedom, period, and not for tyranny. And I'm not defending China, and I'm just saying there's more economic freedom in China. To say that there isn't is detached from reality. And if you want to be detached from reality, that's fine with me. In terms of again, back to 1989, go to the Cato website. We've got a bunch of studies. The quality of life for the average person is better today. And it wouldn't be surprising. I mean, you got cell phones. Just think about all the technological advances you've had since 1989 for the average Joe. So people have a better life. And again, we have a bunch of studies that show that the inequality has probably not increased. There's lots of things you have to adjust for, changes in tax laws, welfare redistributions, the role of Social Security, immigrants, and all that kind of stuff, that we haven't had some massive change in inequality in the United States, and particularly if you take out the 1%. Those are just facts. I mean, those are inconvenient, I know, for people that want to make this an issue. But I guess my fundamental issue is that there's a lot of evidence that economic freedom in general leads to innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, and prosperity. And the history throughout Western civilization and now much of the rest of the world supports that. If we focus, and Milton Friedman had a great quote on this. He said, for those that want less inequality and more growth, they will get more inequality and less growth. And that's exactly what the communist model was and exactly what the outcome was. And so when you take away people's freedom by taking away what they produced, what they created, you will reduce the quality of life for everybody. I do think we have some structural problems in the United States. I think it's a new competition. We had a free ride to some degree after World War II, and we got some challenges. I think the single biggest challenge is our educational system. I would also agree with Yaron. We've had a massive increase in regulation that impacts job creation for new businesses and entrepreneurship on all fronts. And we've been moving in one direction, more regulation, more control, while much of the rest of the world is going in the other direction, and we're getting the outcomes you would expect when you provide more regulation and more control versus somebody that's getting less regulation, less control, and simultaneously improving their educational system.
So big hand to all four of them. Have you recovered, Roger?
No, that'll take a while.
Okay, so in the next 20-25 minutes, what we would like to do is open it up for Q&As. One request that we have, as Christine and I take the mic over to you, is please restrict your time to an actual question rather than a long commentary. I know that each one of us, including me, is very tempted to give some long responses and rebuttals that we ourselves see, but I think it'll be a better discussion if we keep it to questions, short and succinct, and have our panelists talk about it amongst each other. And Christine, just to make sure that Jerry's presence is not missed as much, would you like to come up and kind of take his place? And I'll go ahead and I'll do the Q&A back and forth, just so we make sure that it's still a balanced panel. Fair enough? So we let Christine actually have those 2 moments to have her thoughts, if you'd like, or else I'll just open it to Q&A.
Please just go to Q&A.
Okay. Is it working? Now it is. Okay. And I will be rude and cut you short if you go into a long commentary rather than a question. So please know that.
Thank you. David Jacobs. I have a question for Mr. Brook and Mr. Allison. I'm wondering about the questions about freedom and democracy that were kind of in the background of our conversation. It seems to me that if you want to prevent the minimum wage from being raised, which is a significant form of collective action, you actually have to intervene and keep people from voting. So I'm wondering what your definition of democracy is, or freedom. Do you want to keep people less active, more passive, to make sure property is protected? Thank you.
I think democracy needs to be significantly delimited. I do not believe in majority rule. Majority rule is what killed Socrates. You can laugh, but that's a fact. The citizens of Athens didn't like what Socrates was saying, so they voted. I don't know if it was 51%, I don't know if it was 70%, but they voted to silence Socrates, and they did. The only way to silence Socrates was to have him killed. I don't see a difference between freedom of speech, which I think everybody here would agree should not be put up to democratic vote. I don't believe in hate speech codes. I believe that everybody has a right to free speech. I don't see a difference between freedom of speech, which should not be put up to democratic vote, and property rights, which I don't think should be put up to democratic vote. I don't think what you do with my property should be put up to democracy. How many people think it should be a tennis court? I don't think that's appropriate. I don't think whether you should pick somebody up on the street, to take the example before, should be put up to democratic vote. Whether you can do away with habeas corpus. No, habeas corpus is an absolute. You shouldn't be able to imprison somebody for as long. So it's interesting to me that people on the left tend to think that the social issues, those should be above democracy. We shouldn't vote on abortion, for example. And I agree, by the way. We shouldn't vote on abortion. Abortion is a right. But somehow, on what to do with John's bank, that's okay for us to vote. On how much to pay people, that's okay for us to vote. I want freedom. I want people to go out there and be able to do with their property and with their time and with their life as they see fit. Unless they use force on other people or commit fraud, the state, i.e. democracy, has no role in their lives, should have no ability to dictate what they say. So I would like to see a much more robust constitution, a much more robust Bill of Rights. Luckily for America, we have in a Bill of Rights, we have a First Amendment that gives us the right for free speech. So we can't have hate laws like they do in Canada, where they've imprisoned or fined people for saying stuff that some people found offensive. And many countries in Europe have hate speech laws. In America, we don't. So even if 51% of the people want hate speech laws, we can't have them. I would like to see a more robust Bill of Rights, which take things out of ability to vote on them.
I would just add the United States is not a democracy. If we were a democracy, we wouldn't be here. The United States is a constitutional republic based on the principle of individual rights. In the model of the United States, the purpose of the government, and its only purpose, but a very important purpose, is to protect individual rights, is to keep me from using force or fraud to take what you've earned, and to keep you from using force or fraud to take what I've earned. The reason that is important is that government has a very unique power. They have the ability to use a gun. Walmart can beg you to buy products and services, but they can't make you. The government can make you. They can take your property, they can put you in jail, they can shoot you. And throughout history, after old age and disease, government is the third largest cause of death. Governments have slaughtered hundreds of millions of people throughout history. They're very dangerous people. That's why I believe government should be constrained, and why individual rights should be protected. And I would say this for the progressives in here, whenever you say that this should be done, I want you to ask yourself, would you take a gun and put it to somebody's head and make them do something that they don't want to do. Because that's what you're doing, right? These policemen that go out there and do this, they represent you, right? They're taking a gun and making you do something that you don't want to do. I'm an advocate of gay marriage. I think gay marriage, I think individuals have the right to contract, and you don't lose the right to contract because of your sexual preferences. So I'm a strong advocate of gay marriage. On the other hand, I don't think that the government should force somebody that's running a bakery to serve a gay wedding if that person doesn't want to do it. And when you're doing that, that means that you're willing to take a gun, go into this bakery, put a gun up to somebody's head and say, if you don't serve this wedding, I'm going to shoot you, put you in jail, take your property. And would you really do that? Because government is about the use of force. And it should only be used in the act of self-defense, to keep me from taking what you've earned by force or fraud, and to keep you from taking what I've earned by force or fraud. And whenever you let the lions loose, they eat a lot of people.
I'm just curious about the rhetorical theory. Is the rhetorical theory you're using, if you say it over and over and over and over and over, those people are more likely to believe you? Like one more time, one more rep? It's sort of like athletics.
So is the rhetorical theory here by insulting us, you think?
Yeah, what an asshole. You like being an asshole? Is that effective?
No. I literally was just wondering.
Because
you said it
a couple times.
Okay.
All right, next question.
Jim Otteson from Wake Forest University. I would like to ask the panelists, if you had the ability to solve one social ill but not the other, would you choose inequality or poverty? And if so, whatever choice you make, why do you choose that?
Who wants to go first? Go ahead.
Poverty, as I said, I don't care about inequality. I think it's irrelevant. I think what matters is the ability of individual human beings to flourish. And certainly, if poverty is being imposed on people, we should eliminate the barriers from people being able to rise up from poverty. That's the much bigger issue.
I agree.
Yeah, I would pick poverty as well. I think again, I really think that for an economy to work, people have to feel that they have a chance by hard work, investment, that they can do better rather than feel stagnated in poverty.
And I don't know what Jerry would say, so I have a hard time even
Say what you would say.
I won't be controversial given that I'm here, so I'll say poverty too.
You have this issue about 51% on democracy, and you worry about that in the United States. If they have democracy in China, where they got 1 billion people inside who are dirt poor and 600 million outside who are wealthy, wouldn't they have the same result that you're worried about in the States? That once you get that 51%, you lose all the capitalism, you lose all the growth? I mean, I want people to have more freedom in China, but I think that's an issue.
So I'm having a slightly just what is the question behind it?
The question is, you're worried that in the States, at least my understanding is, that we'll lose our democratic capitalism at 51%, when that 48% go down to up to 51%.
No. So if I can state
clarify
correctly,
it.
I don't think we will, quote, lose democratic capitalism. It's if the 51% feel that the current kind of economic rules of the game, which is a whole complicated set of rules that we now have, isn't working, there will be a dramatic change. The last time the world had that dramatic change, right, virtually all of Europe went either totalitarian, outright communist, or socialist. And so I just don't want to see that kind of dramatic shift based on too big a part of the populace not feeling that there's a way forward. So I'm not saying that they will go totalitarian or communist, but I'd rather not have a dramatic shift against the principles of democratic capitalism that made America the #1 capitalist country on the face of the planet.
My question is about critical thinking because I absolutely agree with what you said. And the reason is because I was fortunate enough to be in private schools all my life until a few years ago I got a job in a teaching institution. And I noticed that, I mean, I was like hit by a meteor because I was living in a bubble all my life, I noticed, because I can't get my students to do even a little bit of critical thinking, no matter how hard I try. And it's similar for my colleagues. My question is, how can you increase training in critical thinking in a system where there are institutions in the US that are actively going to state senate by state senate, trying to get rid of tenure, trying to put more and more layers of paperwork on middle level and high school teachers who don't have any time to teach anymore, and most of all, in a system where, interestingly, in the name of, I hate that word now, accountability, increasingly student scores are tied to teachers' pay, which is a mistake we would never make in even business. Although it's the business people who are running education right now, unfortunately, but in the same way, so that's why the education system is going down. How can you possibly increase critical thinking in a system like that where all the measures are wrong, paperwork has taken over? Because at this point, I'm so depressed, I cannot see any way out. Thank you.
I think that's a great comment, and I think it's a common expression of people I talk to, particularly in the public school system. I think the answer is to total privatization of education. I think you should be subsidizing students and not schools. I think that would create competition and innovation, and schools that practice the patterns you're talking about and had bad outcomes would eventually go out of business, and schools that had radically better outcomes would grow. I think it's wrong to even look at private education today. I think if you really privatized education, what you would have, you'd have some Sam Waltons and Steve Jobs and those kind of people. Then you'd have huge innovation. Eventually, you'd have experimentation, some successes, some failures. Markets are fundamentally experiments, and most of the experiments are failing. For every Walmart, there's 10,000 failed Walmarts. For every Google, there are 10,000 failed Googles. What we really need in the educational process is experimentation and rewards for objective outcomes and what the students actually know at the end of the day in terms of critical thinking ability. I don't think you'll ever get that from a government bureaucracy. I think it's just not the nature of government bureaucracies with which what the public education system is.
So if I had one thing to do on that front, it would be vouchers. So I concur on the only thing that disciplines any business is the ability to lose a customer, and if you confer a monopoly right to serve on any organization, it goes to hell in the handbasket and pretty quick, right? Think of your cable TV company, right? If they were given a monopoly right to serve you, they show up when they feel like showing up because they know you can't go away. So I think having a voucher system that enables schools to be kind of disciplined severely by the market would be helpful. The other thing that's a part of the puzzle, though, I really think is, I really think we're still in what I hope to be the tail end of a sort of a modernist technocratic view of education. It's sort of, there are subject areas, and you need to have transferred from their brain to your brain this stuff on a bunch of subject areas, and we'll narrow those subject areas so that we can figure out whether the knowledge transfer happen, not can you think about problems of the sort that the world needs you to think about. So I think you've got the conflation of monopoly right to serve and a sort of a technocratic conceptualization of what education is, and they're both fighting against what you would like to see. I think for the most part, it feels to me as though it's going to have to get worse before it gets better. Like, I'd love to be able to say, no, we're right at the bottom now, and I can see the turn coming. I think it's more like another decade probably of heading mainly south with some experiments that are going on in some charter schools and the like, but another 10 years of it, and then enough of a crash and burn that you'll have a new model, new conceptualization emerging.
Let me just mention an experiment that's going on in the state of Nevada. The state of Nevada just passed something called education saving accounts. where the state will take the amount of money that they spend on a kid in a public school, and if you don't want to send your kid to public school, they'll put it into a saving account for you. You can use that money for a private school, you can use it to homeschool, you can use it to have your kid take courses on the internet, which is going to allow for, I think, some innovative technology for education to come out of Silicon Valley. You can also roll that money over, if you have any left, to pay for your kids' college education. So I think this is potentially a real mechanism to break that monopoly power and to provide parents with real choices, and choices that go beyond kind of the conventional educational choices that are out there, and to provide kind of technological innovation and entrepreneurship in the educational space. If this could go national, or if it could go to some bigger states than Nevada, I think it could have real impact.
So I'm not in favor of vouchers, but I also don't have the right answer. I mean, it's a really complex problem. So charter schools, I've done some work on charter schools, right? That the idea is we're going to get more innovation, we're going to get experimentation, we're going to have competition, and you see some great schools, but it's not clear that it is solving the problem, and people have been experimenting with that. And so the accountability movement, I think, so the worry is, okay, it's an experiment, it doesn't work, that's good, that school will go away, but there's a generation of kids that actually were in part of that experiment and now are not educated. And so I think that's a worry for me in that process. And I think the accountability movement is to try and keep sort of that from being able to happen, right? But how do you innovate if you're also trying to be accountable at the same time? It's nearly impossible for teachers to do both. Don't have an answer, but I don't necessarily agree with my panelists.
Just as a comment, as a follow-up on that, I read a recent article on the fact that we spend $19 billion on professional development in the United States for high school teachers. And the challenge, of course, out here is that if you talk to the average teacher, they'll say that much of the mandated professional development activities for them is a total waste of time. So that's $19 billion that we're spending on professional development that are largely mandated and what they think are useless because they have to go in. They don't necessarily learn because the incentives aren't aligned according to the teachers too, because they don't pay the teachers who are doing the professional development enough to get the best teachers. And so you've got the entry-level teachers incentivized to do these professional training courses without necessarily any kind of experience on what it is that they're doing. So this is straight out of the news in the last 2 days. I'm going to head it back to Eric, and then I'm going to give it back to you, Clark.
Thank you. Eric Guthey from the Copenhagen Business School. And just as an aside, we don't have a king. We have a very strong welfare state, but that's not my question. My question is not about the issues you're debating, but about the debate itself, because I've heard this debate and the tenor of this debate millions of times before, and we're going to go into an American presidential election, so we're going to hear it again. And I'm curious about your own reflections on how this debate is going or has gone, because it would have been a better question to ask 5 minutes ago when you degenerated all into name-calling. But basically, how are we going to do anything when this is basically, there's even the nature of facts and evidence don't matter when we have ideological sides squaring off against each other. And so I just wonder how it feels to sit up there and be in yet another one of these debates where there's no way anybody's going to agree because the starting point is just so far apart that it's almost pointless to have the debate.
Well, I do a lot of these debates, so you're not trying to convince the other side. I mean, the point of the debate is not to convince the other side. They're convinced, and I find that people over a certain age almost never change their minds about anything important. It's very hard. The debate is a debate for your students. The debate is the debate for young people who are shaping their ideology and shaping their minds. It's very difficult to change people's minds. I've seen. And this is why I don't have slides, because I can bring out graphs from as prominent academic journals as those are, as prominent economists as Piketty, although I don't know if there is anybody as prominent as Piketty these days, who show not the opposite, but that that's not true, that the arguments being made are not true. At the end of the day, this is an ideological debate. This is not a debate about facts. This is about the nature of freedom. This is about the nature of government. This is about the role of government. And the facts associated with that kind of debate are different than the kind of graphs about inequality over the last 50 years and whether the quality of life of the middle class has changed since 1989. Because even if I agree that the quality of life is not, a lot of people have stagnated since 89, which I don't completely agree, but I think it's stagnated more than it should have, then the question is why? And I blame it almost exclusively on government regulation, government control, and tax policy, and so on. And my opponent probably blames it on things that are very different. So it is an ideological debate. It's a philosophical debate. And at the end of the day, we're going to have to resolve the philosophical debate. But look, all of human history is a philosophical debate. There's a wonderful book, which I recommend, called The Cave and the Light, which is an exploration of the idea that Western civilization has basically followed the debate between Aristotle and Plato. And when one side wins, you get a certain set of consequences, and when the other side wins, you get another set of consequences. We're still fighting the Plato-Aristotle debate. The debate between democracy and between freedom, my conception of freedom, not his conception of my conception of freedom, it goes back to Aristotle and Plato. And these are fundamental philosophical debates. We need to have them. We need to keep debating them. I think one side's right and the other side's wrong. And I try to convince that my side's right and the other side is wrong, but you guys have to decide. Really, debates are not about the other party on the stage. The debates are about the audience and whether you provide intellectual ammunition to the audience or you change people's minds. Sometimes you change people's minds. It's rare, but sometimes you do. But it's really about you guys. It's not about us on stage.
So I'd offer a book too. I've been reading Jonathan Haidt's book it's called The Righteous Mind from NYU, and he would argue it's about moral psychology, and that we have if you sort of go back to sort of the basic moral principles, we differ. Like we disagree fundamentally at a deep moral level about what equality is, and you're right, we're not going to convince each other. These are not things that are going to get resolved. I'm not really looking forward to the next presidential race for the reasons that you draw out. He's got a new book coming out that's about capitalism and sort of, I haven't read that one yet, so I don't know if Jonathan would have better insights there, but he would say this is deep, like this is about our morality, our sense of morality.
Just a quick point on the elections. One of the things I find depressing about the elections is you're not going to get a real debate. It's shades of gray. It's the difference between Democrats and Republicans in the United States over most issues is very, very small. If you look at George Bush's policies towards the end of his, particularly in the last 4 years, and President Obama's policies, yeah, there's a difference, but it's not a fundamental philosophical distance. It's just a matter of a little bit further to the left on the spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, I do think back to Aristotle as well, and I think he had something important to say about this kind of discussion. Right? I mean, he divided the world into two pieces. One is the part of the world where things cannot be other than they are, and he wrote about that in Analytica Posteriora, and then he wrote about the part of the world where things can be other than they are, and he wrote about that in Rhetoric. And the world has basically taken Analytica Posteriora and applied it to the whole world. And that's one of the reasons why we're sort of befuddled by the fact that the data doesn't show what reality is. And other people say, I have a different reality. He said, yeah, in most part of the world, there is no objective reality. The world will be what you make it. And in that part of the world, so in the part of the world where things cannot be other than they are, he said, use essentially the scientific method, where you're trying to demonstrate, he said the purpose of science to demonstrate that things cannot be other than they are, right? In the part of the world we're talking about, things can be a million different ways, right? Each of these countries evolves on the basis of what people do. There isn't an objective reality. And in that part of the world, he said, the thinking task is to create possibilities and choose the one for which the most persuasive argument can be made. And so what's happening with these debates, why there isn't convergence, is we think it's scientific, right? in which case you do converge in due course. Science in due course hopefully converges on the truth, the thing that cannot be other than it is. If I drop this, it does accelerate at 9.8 meters per second squared. We get to that truth. In this domain, there is no truth. There are just arguments, and people, rightly try and make the most persuasive argument they can. That's why, do people read the Isaacson book about Jobs, right? Where people inside derisively referred to him as having a reality distortion field around his head, right? That he just believed stuff to be the case that they knew were not real. He was being unrealistic. But he was doing what Aristotle said. Aristotle said, imagine possibilities, which he consistently did, and then argue persuasively for them and make them happen. So I think the desire for convergence is a misapplication of science to the domain in which we're hoping for the convergence. There ain't going to be convergence.
One of the comments, I guess, reinforcing Yaron's point, I don't do debates like this before adults. Rajshree twisted my arm to do this debate. I do it before students, because students are at least interested in these ideas. And the reason I think our side, what I call the free society side, the libertarian side, needs to be out there is the media has a very kind of consistent, slightly left bias, and I think that those of us that believe in free societies need to be out there offering an alternative to that discussion, and so that's why I do it. By the way, Jonathan Hay, interesting you mentioned, he just made a speech at a Cato event in New York City, and he told me he had been a liberal all his life, and he's becoming a libertarian. So I thought there is some hope, and some older people do change their minds.
And I'm happy to say he's one of the fellows at the Martin Prosperity Institute. So he's doing the new project that he's working on, that he probably gave a talk on, is being partially funded by us.
Thank you. Clark Warner, Boston University School of Theology. I can help you with ultimate truth, actually, if you'd like to talk afterwards. Jonathan Haidt is my hero, and I think largely because some of the work he's done may help to make some of the debates like this less contentious and provide some insight into people that philosophically disagree and understand what's behind that. My question for you guys is largely about the role of the state in the preservation of economic freedom. And I ask because, and this may not be a great example, there are certainly instances in the past where economic freedom has been constrained. So if you go back to the 1950s, the United States, African Americans trying to get a hotel room in the South, not possible. And it took the US government's Supreme Court expansion of the Commerce Clause to make that go away. Similarly, segregation in both public schools and especially higher education institutions required the government's intervention to do that. There's, I think, pretty good evidence that pure, ultimate, laissez-faire policies don't always work. So for example, the reserve wage in Chicago for poor African Americans, I'll be quick, is lower than that of other people, and yet unemployment in that community persists. So where do you see the role of the state in preserving and or enforcing economic freedom, and where do you say it should not be involved? And in the cases where it should not be involved, what is the answer when there's persistent issues the free market doesn't address?
So, so I disagree with your final statement, I guess, about laissez-faire capitalism doesn't work. I think it does, and looking more closely at Chicago would be interesting. But I think the problems in Chicago have everything to do with the fact that the educational system does not produce graduates who can make the minimum wage, and the fact that licensing laws in Chicago are quite horrific. And there's a whole culture. There's a bad culture in Chicago that I think is partially being instituted there because of the welfare state. But the role of the state is not to discriminate itself. I think much of the discrimination in the South during the pre-1960s was fostered by the fact that the state legally was discriminating, right? And the discrimination was institutionalized into the law. You indeed did not have equality before the law, and that had to be dismantled. So the state itself cannot, it needs to uphold the equality before the law. And beyond that, I think the only job of the state is to protect us from fraud, to protect us from crooks and criminals. But other than that, leave markets alone, completely alone, and not intervene even when there is a perceived social injustice perceived by certain people. Then argue for it, make your case, and force the market to change its behavior. It's not the role of government to pull out a gun and to force that change on people. And yes, government is a gun. I know you smile every time that is said, and I know I'm repeating myself, and that's not a correct thing. Although in pedagogy you're taught, and in rhetoric you're taught, that repetition is actually a positive thing. Government is force, that's its nature, and I don't think you can force or should force social change on people at the point of a gun.
And from if you want me to answer too? Okay. What I would say is that if politicians make a persuasive argument that causes 51+% of people to vote for them, they have the right within the Supreme Court kind of oversight to address issues that more than 51% of people think are issues. And it's up to, in the world of ideas, the person who thinks that that is an intrusion into the lives of people in the country. It's up to them to win that argument, to be more persuasive in making that argument.
I have to say I find that interesting because 51% of the people in the South wanted to deny equal rights to minorities. There was a majority rule in the South. It's evil, bad, but 51% of the people with a white majority wanted to deny equal rights to minorities. So this goes back to rights belong to individuals, not to groups. By the way, I tell you a funny story. It's an interesting story. My granddad ran a grocery store that was in a swing black-white neighborhood. And it's funny things you remember. I was just a real kid, but I remember him coming home. He was just fuming because he was just barely making enough money to live. He had been fined by the city because he only had one bathroom. He didn't have a black-white bathroom. And the state, the government, required him to have a black-white bathroom, which he couldn't really afford. And so I do think government and the majority create a lot of these bad. I mean, up to very recently, the majority of the people wanted to deny gays the right to marry. And that's wrong, even though the majority wanted it.
So, thank you very much for being here. This has definitely been a very, very controversial, very engaging discussion. I appreciate both sides representing themselves and standing ground, and I particularly appreciate the last one of the comments that was made, in that this is really not a debate about convincing the other side. It is a debate so that we can inform both sides of the issue to the young minds, rather than just having one versus the other be predominantly represented. So on that note, we're all teachers, we're all faculty members that are in charge of young minds. In addition, we're parents too. And so one of the things that I hope is that this conversation has us thinking about what are the implications of these questions as we raise the next generation of leaders, of citizens, and of a good republic, if you will. At the end of the day, we all, I think, are united about the one thing, I think, largely, that we do want the best for each individual to their highest potential. The way we might expect that best to occur may very well be different. However, I think we are on that united. Yes? No? Yes? Just checking. Okay, thank you very much. A big hand to all of them.
Thank you.